Picture this. It's 1945. A group of German widows stands outside a prisoner of war camp in rural Texas, their faces twisted in contempt. They've been told stories by Nazi propaganda for years. Americans are weak, soft, corrupted by their easy lives and jazz music. These women, who've lost husbands to the Eastern Front, look at the camp with disdain, convinced that the men inside are nothing more than cowards who surrendered rather than fight to the death like real soldiers. But then the gates open. What emerges isn't what they expected. These aren't the malnourished, defeated men they'd been told about. Instead, towering figures stride out, American soldiers standing 6 feet tall and taller, their shoulders broad, their arms thick with muscle. They move with an easy confidence, laughing and joking with each other, their teeth white and straight, their skin healthy and sun-bronzed. The German widows fall silent. Their expressions shift from mockery to shock, then to something else entirely, a dawning realization that everything they'd been told was a lie. This is the story of how German citizens, particularly women who'd survived the war, came face to face with a truth that shattered years of propaganda. This is the story of perception versus reality, of how World War II wasn't just won on battlefields, but in the stark contrast between two nations' treatment of their people. To understand this moment, we need to rewind. For over a decade, the Nazi propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to paint Americans as weak, decadent, and racially inferior. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, orchestrated a campaign that portrayed America as a nation of gangsters, controlled by Jews, corrupted by African American culture, and softened by materialism. German citizens were shown carefully selected images and films. They saw Depression-era breadlines and called it American poverty. They saw jazz clubs and called it cultural degeneracy. They were told that American men were cowards who wouldn't fight, that they'd collapse at the first sign of real combat, that they were no match for the hardened, disciplined German soldier. German women, particularly those who became widows during the war, absorbed these messages. Many of them had watched their husbands march off to war with pride, believing in the superiority of the German military and the righteousness of their cause. When those husbands didn't return, killed on the frozen steppes of Russia or in the deserts of North Africa, these women clung even harder to the propaganda. It was easier to believe their men had died fighting against worthy opponents in the East, while dismissing the Western allies as insignificant. By 1944 and 1945, as the war turned decisively against Germany, the propaganda became even more desperate. The Americans were coming, yes, but they were portrayed as barbaric occupiers who would destroy German culture. Better to coup. Fear them than to respect them, the propaganda said. But there was a problem with this narrative, one that became increasingly difficult to hide. Actual American prisoners of war held in German camps. When American soldiers were captured, particularly after major battles like the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, they were marched through German towns on their way to POW camps. This was meant to be a propaganda victory, a chance for German civilians to see these weak Americans defeated and captured. Instead, something unexpected happened. German civilians, particularly women, stared in disbelief at these prisoners. Despite having been captured, despite having marched for days, despite being in enemy hands, these American soldiers looked healthy. They were tall, noticeably taller than the average German soldier. They had strong builds, good teeth, and even in captivity, a certain vitality that shocked observers. One German woman later recounted watching a column of American POWs march through her town in early 1945. She had expected to see broken men, defeated and weak. Instead, she saw soldiers who, even in capture, looked better fed and healthier than many German soldiers she'd seen. They were like giants, she recalled. We had been told they were soft, but these men looked stronger than our own boys. This wasn't an isolated observation. Throughout Germany, civilians were having their assumptions challenged by the physical reality of American prisoners. But the full impact wouldn't be felt until the roles were reversed. Here's where the story takes its most dramatic turn. As the war progressed, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were captured by American forces and shipped across the Atlantic to POW camps in the United States. Between 1943 and 1946, approximately 375,000 German POWs were held in over 500 camps spread across the American mainland. These camps were located in places most Germans had never heard of: Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, rural corners of America where land was plentiful and security concerns were minimal. The German prisoners were in for a shock. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were supposed to be treated humanely, and the United States took this seriously, perhaps more seriously than any other nation involved in the war. German POWs in America received the same rations as American soldiers. Let that sink in. Enemy prisoners were eating the same food as the men guarding them. What did this mean in practice? It meant 3 substantial meals a day. It meant meat regularly, not the ersatz substitutes Germany had been using since 1942, but actual beef, pork, and chicken. It meant fresh vegetables, milk, bread made with real wheat, coffee, and even occasional treats like ice cream and chocolate. For German soldiers who'd been surviving on increasingly meager rations, especially those captured in 1944 and 1945 when the German food situation was desperate, this was incomprehensible. Many initially refused to eat, suspecting the food was poisoned or that they were being fattened up for some sinister purpose. It took seeing American guards eating the same food to convince them it was safe. Within weeks, the transformation was visible. German POWs began to gain weight and regain their health. Men who'd arrived gaunt and exhausted started to look healthy again. The contrast with the deteriorating situation back home in Germany became starkly apparent. This brings us back to our opening scene, though the reality was actually more complex and widespread than a single encounter. Throughout the war, and particularly in 1945 and 1946, German POWs held in America were put to work. The United States was experiencing a labor shortage with so many men overseas, and the Geneva Convention allowed POWs to work for wages. German prisoners worked on farms and factories, in forestry, jobs that brought them into contact with American civilians. This is where German women, including war widows who'd emigrated before the war or who encountered these prisoners through work programs, came face to face with the reality of American strength. These women, many still clinging to Nazi propaganda about American weakness, expected to see defeated, inferior men. Instead, they saw German prisoners who'd been transformed by American captivity. The prisoners themselves would tell stories that seemed impossible: camps with recreational facilities, sports programs, even camp newspapers and orchestras. They spoke of American guards who were generally fair, of a legal system that protected even enemy prisoners' rights, of medical care that was prompt and effective. But more striking than the treatment of the prisoners was the sight of the American soldiers themselves. The guards at these camps were often men deemed unfit for frontline combat, too old, previously wounded, or in support roles. Yet even these second-tier American soldiers impressed with their size, health, and equipment. One German woman working in a camp kitchen in Texas later wrote about her experience. She'd lost her husband on the Eastern Front and had internalized the Nazi message about American inferiority. Then she saw American soldiers up close. They were enormous, like nothing I'd expected. Well-fed, strong, laughing all the time. They had perfect teeth. All of them had perfect teeth. Their uniforms were clean and well-made. They had so much equipment, so many supplies. Everything was abundant. I realized then that we had never stood a chance. How do you defeat a nation that treats even its prisoners better than we treated our own soldiers? What these German women and POWs were witnessing was the fundamental economic and industrial disparity between the United States and Germany. America in World War II was an industrial colossus operating at a scale Germany couldn't match. The U.S. hadn't been bombed, its cities were intact, its farmland was productive, and its factories ran around the clock, producing not just weapons, but an overwhelming abundance of everything a military needed. American soldiers were the best-fed military force in history up to that point. The U.S. Army's daily ration provided approximately 4,000 calories, more than most Americans ate in civilian life. The K ration alone, meant for combat situations, was more nutritious than what German soldiers were getting in regular circumstances. This wasn't just about food. American soldiers had multiple uniforms, well-made boots that were replaced when worn, comprehensive medical care including penicillin, a drug that gave Americans a tremendous advantage in treating wounds, and endless supplies of everything from ammunition to cigarettes. German POWs would observe American supply convoys and be stunned. One former prisoner recalled, "I watched trucks bringing supplies to the camp day after day. More food than we could eat, new uniforms, medical supplies, recreational equipment. It never stopped coming. In Germany, we'd spent years being told to sacrifice, to make do with less, that we were winning through superior will. Here I was, a prisoner, eating better than I had in years, watching an endless river of American abundance, and I understood that the war had been lost before it even really began. You cannot defeat such wealth with ideology." For German women, particularly widows, this realization was devastating in a different way. Many had lost husbands who died believing in German superiority and the righteousness of their cause. They'd endured years of hardship, rationing, and bombing, all while being told that victory was inevitable and that the enemy was weak. To discover that their sacrifices had been based on lies, that their husbands had died fighting a war that was unwinnable from the start, that the enemy they'd been taught to despise was actually prosperous and powerful. This was a psychological earthquake. Some German women responded with anger, feeling betrayed by their own government. Others fell into depression, unable to reconcile their losses with this new reality. Still others, particularly younger women, began to see Americans not as enemies, but as representatives of a better way of life. The U.S. military was aware of this shift. American commanders recognized that every interaction between Americans and German civilians was an opportunity for denazification, the process of breaking down Nazi ideology and replacing it with democratic values. The contrast between Nazi promises and American reality was one of the most effective tools in this effort. When the war ended in May 1945, this process accelerated. American forces occupied Western Germany, and for the first time, large numbers of German civilians encountered American soldiers directly. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Germany was devastated, cities in ruins, food scarce, infrastructure destroyed, the population traumatized and desperate. Into this landscape came American soldiers with their jeeps, their chewing gum, their chocolate bars, and their care packages. The U.S. military implemented programs to feed German civilians, particularly children. The famous care packages became symbols of American generosity. German women and children would line up for food distributions, and many later recalled their astonishment at American abundance, even in the midst of Europe's devastation. German war widows, in particular, found themselves in a complex position. Many had lost everything: husbands, homes, sometimes children. They'd been indoctrinated to hate and fear Americans. Yet here were American soldiers offering food, providing medical care, helping rebuild, and generally treating Germans with a humanity that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had claimed. Numerous German women ended up marrying American soldiers. Estimates suggest over 50,000 such marriages between 1945 and 1949. These war brides emigrated to America and encountered yet another shock. American prosperity wasn't just military abundance, but a whole society built on a scale they'd never imagined. The story of German widows mocking American men, only to be shocked by the reality of American soldiers, is more than just an anecdote from World War II. It's a profound illustration of how propaganda can distort perception and how reality, when finally encountered, can shatter long-held beliefs. These German women had been taught that strength came from ideology, from racial purity, from militant discipline and sacrifice. They believed that hardship made you stronger, that suffering was noble, that their cause was just despite the costs. What they discovered was that real strength came from something entirely different, from economic prosperity, from technological advancement, from treating even your enemies with a baseline of human dignity, from a society that valued the individual and built systems that made people healthy and strong rather than working them to exhaustion. The giant American soldiers who emerged from those camps weren't giants because of some genetic superiority or ideological fervor. They were giants because they came from a society that was wealthy enough, organized enough, and humane enough to feed its people well, provide them with health care, and build a military machine that could project power across 2 oceans while maintaining abundance at home. For the German widows who witnessed this, the moment of recognition must have been both awe-inspiring and tragic. Awe-inspiring because they were seeing a glimpse of a different kind of society, one where abundance rather than scarcity was the norm. Tragic because they understood, perhaps for the first time, what their husbands had really died for, not for a glorious cause, but for a lie, for a regime that had squandered Germany's strength and led its people into disaster. The lesson resonates far beyond World War II. It reminds us that propaganda can only distort reality for so long. Eventually, truth breaks through, and when it does, when people see with their own eyes the difference between the stories they've been told and the reality before them, no amount of ideology can maintain its grip. Those German widows learned this lesson in the starkest way possible, by watching their former enemies demonstrate, simply by existing, that everything they'd believed was wrong. It was a humbling moment, a devastating moment, but also, perhaps, a liberating one. Because once you see through a lie, you can never quite believe it again. And in that moment of clarity, however painful, there's the possibility of building something better, something based on truth rather than propaganda, on abundance rather than scarcity, on human dignity rather than dehumanization. The giants who walked out of those camps weren't really giants at all. They were just men, well-fed and well-equipped, from a nation that had figured out how to harness its resources for both war and human welfare. But to eyes conditioned by years of propaganda and hardship, they might as well have been mythical beings, living proof that everything Nazi Germany had promised was a lie, and that another way of life was not only possible, but real.